book has done. What we found as we were working on this for 10 years, for the first 200 years, is that, first of all, and we talked about this a little bit last time, is that there were basically no Christians in the first 2 centuries. That is, no one was calling themselves Christians. And in fact, there were so many different kind of what one might call Jesus groups or Jesus schools or Jesus clubs, they weren't some kind of religion, but they were a bunch of groups working on different kinds of parts of their life. And so what we found is that there were a whole bunch of different directions that the Jesus peoples were going for those 2 centuries. And there it was very surprising to us that basically no one had asked the larger question of what are those first 2 centuries like for all the Jesus peoples, and how could it be that they are going in many times in various directions at the same time. So that's where we went last week. What I want to do next here, and I'm going to ask you, in case you've been thinking about some things since last week, you may want to have some questions or protests or thoughts of your own before we go forward to the next stage. But I will say right now that the next stage that we're going to do for another 10 to 15 minutes fairly soon is to talk about the Roman Empire and how basically the Roman Empire had conquered all of the other nations in the Mediterranean basin and was stunningly full of violence. So what we're going to be asking fairly soon in tonight is to think about how the Jesus peoples had to come to terms with stunningly raw violence in everybody's life. So I'm going to stop here and see if, as I've been describing a little bit of what we did last time, to see if something since last week you found yourself puzzling about something, thinking about something that was making a difference for you, or hearing something from me that you thought was wrong or at least goofy. So let's just stop for a moment to see if some of you might have some of those responses.
All right. Elaine used the hand raise function.
I did.
We'll start with Elaine and then we'll go to Reverend
Hey.
Hale.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much. I was thinking from last week, and I don't know exactly how much geographic territory we're talking about when we're talking about how far the Jesus people ranged, but I'm wondering, how did the information about Jesus, about this man, about his actions, about what he did, how did it travel? I mean, obviously word of mouth, but were there there was no internet, there was no TV. Were there any established communication networks that would have enabled this information to travel as far as it did and as quickly as it did?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elaine. And let me say a couple of things. One is it spread, a lot spread in those first 2 centuries, mainly because Rome had just got finished conquering every other nation in the entire Mediterranean basin. So, we're talking all along Northern Africa. We're all along Southern Europe, all along all the way out to Spain and the far coast of Africa, all along back into the Eastern Mediterranean. So in other words, that's a lot of territory. And what had happened is no one was free anymore. Basically, Rome had conquered everything. Rome wanted to destroy the civilizations of all the other peoples. And in one of the processes it sees that happened there is Rome built a lot of roads. So probably some of the best roads anywhere at that time, and they did it very well, and that allowed them to go everywhere with economics, with a military, with culture, and especially with their own interest in conquering as much as possible. So that's part of your answer, I think. But the other way to say that, I think, is that, and again, here you want to think possibly that I'm just lying about this next thing, but basically, we don't know how many people in the first 2 centuries there were that were parts of various Jesus groups. And so you have probably 5 or 10 scholars who have, in the last 30 or 40 years, have been guessing at how many people there were that were Jesus people, and how many there were in general in the Mediterranean basin itself. So you have millions of people in the Mediterranean basin itself. The guesses on how many Jesus people there were would be between 20,000 and 40,000 in the first 70 years. Probably near 100,000 by the end of the first century. And probably 200,000 by the end of the second century. Those are sort of big numbers, but what I want to say clearly is that meant just a whole bunch of little groups. In other words, this is, if you look at the millions of people that were in other nations and now conquered, if you look at all of that, the amount of Jesus people was very small, and no one was in charge. Matter of fact, the really interesting thing was that the different various groups that were in some way or another interested in Jesus, those people didn't want somebody in charge of all the different groups. They were one of the main things, and we'll talk more about this later this evening. They really were very happy just to be in their little group. In other words, nobody wanted a religion, and no one wanted to put everybody together and so that everybody believed the same thing or practiced the same thing. So that's a little bit of an overview of geographics.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Thank you very much.
All right, Reverend Heather, and then Sal, and then Julie.
Okay, my question is, and I'm not even sure I'm phrasing this right, but in the reading on resisting the Romans, it talked about how they decided, it sounded like in the book, they decided, the Jesus people, that they would tell people that Jesus was killed to die for their sins. And this is something that we kind of take as part of our faith, that Jesus died for our sins. But I'm wondering, and for us it's biblical, but they didn't have a Bible back then. So where did they come up with this idea, and why do we give it credence if it's something that just came out of their defensiveness? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to take we're going to go right at that in a little bit. So I won't go at everything, but I would want to say the first thing we're going to look at is the practice of crucifixion, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I would want to say that hardly any of the groups, the many groups all around, hardly any of them believed that Jesus died for our sins. In fact, a lot of the people were really interested in thinking about the crucifixion, but that wasn't what they were thinking it meant.
So where did that concept come from?
Much later. I would say at least not until the 4th century is anybody really thinking that. So in other words, your question is perfect in that that really is there's hardly anything like that in these first 2 centuries. And I want in just a minute to tell you what they were talking about in terms of Jesus being tortured to death, which is what happened. Let me see if I think we had a couple of other things, and then we'll jump right into the crucifixion and violence in a few minutes.
All right, Sal, you're up, and then Julie Metz, and then Alex.
My question might be answered the same way as you answered Heather's. That in the teachings that we have in church now, we learn about the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, and yet in the book in chapter 3, it talks about how the women went to the tomb and found it empty, and they never went back and told the disciples because they were afraid. Where we learn that, they came back and told them, and they went somewhere and met Jesus and felt the wounds in his hand. And in fact, according to, what the book writes, that really never happened. So, when did that come to be that we, started to believe in the resurrection part?
I think that the resurrection part is a little bit closer to what was going on in the 1st and 2nd century than the Jesus died for our sins. But what one needs to understand, I was teaching a bunch of pastors today at looking at what the assigned texts for a week from this Sunday are. And there we looked at what were people thinking about the resurrection, and so the resurrection is simply doesn't occur to people in those first 2 centuries of being what one might call historically accurate. Rather, it was about a spirit, that what Paul says when he announces the resurrection, Paul says that's not a physical body. That's a spiritual body. What does Paul mean about a spiritual body? He says really clearly, it's not something that people look that the resurrected body is not what you look at when you see somebody's body before they died. But a lot of people were thinking about rising in the following way. The most important, the biggest personages of that time are the emperors. And the emperors, most of them announced that they themselves were God. And secondly, all of the emperors and all of the people who pay attention to the emperors, all of them say that when each emperor dies, he goes to the sky and becomes a new star. And you can look up and you can see the former emperor, and he is up there as a new star. So you see what I mean? This is, in other words, if in the 2nd century you're told by all of the military and all the teachers that there is what the last emperor is way up there, and he's a star. I mean, like a real star, right? Not a person who is a star like on TV or anything, but it was a real star flashing at you. So yes, it is. People are talking quite a bit about the emperor being rising from the dead to become a star, and other kind of people, including Jesus. But it's not the way some Christians now think that was actually one's body that rose. Okay, we've got a couple more people waiting, and then I'll jump right into the crucifixion.
All right, Julie, Matz, and then I think the last question will be Alex.
I think this is a quick one. When I first read about the fact that the Jesus groups lived in chosen families, I immediately thought about the Shakers. And I wondered if, I see you nodding your head, and I wondered if there is a connection, and are there other groups that are contemporaries of us right now that have adopted ways of the Jesus groups?
Yes, they are. There are some now, but frankly, most of that has disappeared. In other words, families in our day don't look at all like the families of those days. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But the main thing, if you read the chapter about what we called experimental families, it turned out that a lot of the families were very violent themselves. That had a lot to do with Roman imperial information about that. But basically, there were a lot of people running away from their families because their families were so violent, and because Rome was so violent against families. So a lot of the families in the 1st and 2nd century are people who don't share blood. In other words, they come together to be what we would call chosen families. So, for instance, there's one place that that word has been used actually in the last several decades, very importantly. Some of you, I'm sure, know that there are a lot of what one would call families of queer people. That is, there are a lot of peoples who now are forming families, not through a blood family, but through the fact that queer people actually really have lost much of their family, and their families have kicked them out. So those folks, in many ways, and I suspect that many of you know queer people like that, is they have their own families but it's not like mom and dad and so on. It's a experimental family. Okay, well, let me jump in.
One more.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
As we're talking about the first couple of centuries, can you talk about sort of, I guess, your definition for religion, like what is constituting a religion? Are these Jesus people not connecting Jesus to the divine? Because I mean, after last week, I kind of pulled out one of my like first religion textbooks from college. I'm like, these Jesus people are exhibiting different pillars of religion in terms of mealtime ritual, philosophical and ethical discussions, you know, an emotional experience. There's a narrative there, but it might not be mythical at this point. So I'm curious of like, how are you defining religion? Is it about centralized leadership? Is it about a connection to the divine? Is it about sacraments? How are these Jesus people not necessarily a religion, and I guess religions at the time of the first 2 centuries?
Sure. The first thing to say is that by and large, a religion like the modern religions didn't come together for a long time. But it is true that, yes, God was a big deal for a lot of those different, basically small groups. So one is connected to one another as a group through God. But what I mean by religion, for instance, is when you see religion, when you see history going on, there are religions that would be the size of many cultures already. These people don't have power systems going on, and they aren't built around believing the same thing. To a certain extent, some of them are having the same practices, fairly informally. So, for instance, one of the things that we'll talk about, I think, later this evening, is that the way most of the Jesus people got together was by eating a meal. I mean, basically, we don't find any group getting together except by having a meal. And that means that they were quite small, because we know how the dining rooms look. I've been at many of those dining rooms in archaeological contexts, and they will fit somewhere between 10 and 20 people. But there, they would want to say that their god or gods are helping them come together around that meal together, around the conversation they make together, around the songs they sing. But none of those people are saying, oh, and now I want to make my group the size of 50,000. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what I want to say is one of the major reasons that these various Jesus groups have some success. And that is because Rome's violence is so thorough that everybody is really frightened. And there are ways in which these various groups started resisting Roman violence and being creative about new kinds of really new kinds of identities. So identities is one of the reasons. One of the things that the Jesus people do is, hey, come around and hang out with us and think about what's hurting you, what's scaring you, what makes you laugh, and brings us together. Now, so I want to, and I think now I'm going to share my screen, John, if I can. Now, are you all seeing a funny thing on the on your screen? So anybody, this is actually, and we as the book people, we're really proud, because I think this may be the first thing found archaeologically that actually was part of a crucifix. Can you see it? Now, so I want you to, and I'm sorry to gross you out, but so this is a human heel, and you can see the nail going through the human heel. Can you see it? It's just crazy. In other words, but this is we have not found until very recently, we haven't found a real crucifix in those first several centuries. But this we found in a grave. And it is now in the museum in Jerusalem. And we paid a fair amount of money to get a picture of it, just to show that. Now, this is the thing, and I alluded to this last time, but I want us to follow through on this. So, as I said last week, when I read about, when I learned as a child and a young adult about Jesus being crucified, somehow what happened to me is I got the idea that the story was that only Jesus was crucified. And that is that, well, there's a story in the Bible that there were two guys on either side of him, right? But that is counterintuitive to what we actually now know. So, for instance, one of the main historians, just of Israel, wrote a history of Israel in the first century for a period of about 10 years. In that 10 years, Pilate crucified 10,000 people. So this is a tiny little part of Israel, done by Israel, by Roman, basically soldiers that would go into little villages and somewhat bigger, and they would just randomly crucify people. They would crucify them publicly. The idea of crucifixion was to let the public be really scared to death. Because what they would do is they would put they would bring in the crucifixions, and they would just grab people. Sometimes people that were leaders in a village, and they would watch them die. So, in other words, the idea was have the public in all of these towns be forced to watch people die slowly and torturedly. So if there, let's just say, in 10 years, Pilate crucifies 10,000 people. That would mean that probably in the bigger population of the Mediterranean, that would probably mean at least 300,000 in a decade. And what the Romans said was the reason to be crucified was that you were leading a revolt against Rome. And so, in other words, if we catch anybody saying, I hate Rome for all of what it's doing wrong, if you even hear somebody say that, you are on the way to the crucifix. So let's see now, and again, watch me because this doesn't follow necessarily, but if there were 300,000 in the decade that Pilate was working in just Israel, what would happen in a century? That would be 10 times 300,000, right? So a way that I usually help my students understand how much this was is to say that probably everybody's family around the Mediterranean had somebody crucified. So now look at how this, if you would, how this is so different, because we were raised, many of us were raised, that Jesus was more or less the only one to be crucified. The power of the early Jesus people telling the story of Jesus's crucifixion is that it's not different from everybody, it's the same as everybody. So in other words, this was a way that Jesus mostly got known, and that's because he, like a member of each of our families, was tortured to death. So the thing here is that Rome is so thorough in all of this, not just crucifixions, but when Rome goes and conquers another country in the Mediterranean, they will take most of the people that they can capture and haven't killed. They will take most of them as slaves, and they will take them to other parts of the Mediterranean where they can be Roman slaves. Similarly, what happens is when they go in and conquer another country, they tax them really crazily. So we think, and we've got a lot of documents about this. Probably about 20% of what you make in your own business, 20% every year to Rome. So in other words, you have tons of ways of torturing or making you feel like you're about ready to die yourself. So the first thing I want to say in that regard is that we can't really think clearly about the Jesus people except if we realize that it is a horrible empire that is beating everyone down. So it's not anything about Jesus. Jesus is just a relatively random person. It could be that his teaching got Rome mad. That would be right, because Jesus also said that God had a kingdom that was going together, and it was coming together around people who loved God and loved one another. But that doesn't look good for the Romans. They want to kill those people. If those people are trying to bring others together, they're going to get thrown in jail, made slaves, or be crucified, or thrown in jail just to keep them out of the way. So I don't know. I mean, I went to more school after this, but it's so stunning to me that in my high school, in my college, in my graduate studies, and it took until my doctoral studies that I started being told about Rome's violence. Weirdly, in Sunday school class, that was kind of a very, it was either boring or cute for the children itself. So I want to just stop for a moment here and have you protest, ask questions, or think with me about how this shifts what we understand about the different kinds of Jesus groups.
Hey, Hal, just as we go to questions, if you could unshare your screen just so we can make sure we see the folks who are talking, that would be great.
Yes, thank you.
How are we, as we're taught in most, as is taught in most religions, I mean, you know, we learn that Jesus was up on top of a mountain, crucified on a cross. Would we believe then that's true, or would we believe that Jesus was nailed to a tree like the others?
We have no idea. In other words, that story is probably a good 50 years after it happens. And we just don't know. That one of the main things, for instance, is the Romans really loved to just throw the people who got crucified, just throw them in a hole. It was very hard for the people of Israel to find those people who died, because what you wanted really to happen, and this is in Roman documents, you wanted the person who is dying on the cross to have the dogs and the birds to eat the flesh. In other words, you have to see that the Romans were making as many people as possible to be really scared. So no, we and I guess I want to take this to the positive rather than the negative. The things that were written down in the first 2 centuries were written down to help people think with how God is close to them. And in this regard, what one of the reasons that you tell the stories of Jesus's crucifixion, or other people's crucifixion, or Paul's being thrown into jail all the time, all of those are in the Bible. What you want to say to the people who are hanging out with you and want to know stories is, yeah, this guy died by torture, and his death was more or less the same as the people in your family that got crucified. So yes, it's all over the place, but the people that are writing this and telling these stories, they're not trying to make their history wrong. They're trying to put together a story in which all of the people that are also being hurt so badly by Rome know that God's on their side and know that Jesus felt like they did. And when you go to have a meal with another little group of Jesus people, what you have to come to terms with is how bad you feel about loss of so much life and how scared you are for trying to keep on going. And what the messages are on these stories is not to be necessarily exact historically, but saying, listen, this is what so many of us are feeling about so many things that have gone wrong with our peoples.
Sandra.
Hi, thank you. You can hear me this week. I think it was a
I
matter of
can, yes, and
pulling out my headphones last
I
time.
I also remember your great question, so thank you.
A couple of comments and then a question. Just interestingly enough, this idea of the identification and the death, and I think, you know, as theology is developed, and certainly this idea of you know, God assuming all of your humanity and our full humanity, and you can see then how this is quite attractive in that, you know, he shares all things like us, even the way we die, you know, and so and so actually that would be quite quite helpful, you know. He is like us in every way, even the way that we die. And then also I'm reading about kind of, you know, this kind of ways of resistance, and also I can see how whatever you make of the resurrection, you know, that's another a different subject, but you can see that this would be an interesting development of the ultimate kind of way to resist. If you can say that the worst that Rome can do to you, actually we can flip this on its side to say this is the greatest thing, actually. So the cross isn't like the worst thing. This is actually the moment of glory. And that, you know, certainly we as theologians have made it all sorts of that, and, you know, Christian faith and doctrine and all that, but actually going back, thinking about what that would mean right in the time of resisting this power, that actually if we can kind of put our kind of nose up to you and say, you can kill us, but actually this is this person's greatest glory, is kind of an interesting thing you can see how that be developed. And then my question is, you know, what we're looking at tonight is a lot about, you know, Rome's violence, and, you know, Rome being, this is their mode of crucifixion. But I wonder what you would say. I mean, you know, the Gospels that we have them make a lot of actually conflict, not with Rome, but conflict with Jesus, with his own, right? Conflict with religious leaders. And that's actually quite kind of crucial to why he's killed, you know. And you're right, the answer, why does Jesus die? Well, the simplest answer is because people killed him, but because he was a troublemaker among his own as much as he was a troublemaker to Rome. In fact, Pilate, you know, is almost like, oh, do you really want me to do this with this person? Like, you know, really, he's not that troublesome, but they want him dead. So, you know, give to us Barabbas, you know, you make so. Anyway, so I'm just wondering if you wanted to.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to say a little bit more about that. The first thing is that the Romans were very strict about keeping people to not have weapons. So in other words, there are no people of Israel who have anything to kill anybody with. And so here I would want to say that it is true that one of the great things that happened in the people of Israel during the 1st and 2nd century was that there was a lot of diversity. In other words, there too, you had a very relaxed kind of multiplicity that's going on within different kinds of people of Israel. And it's a later portion of some of the stories told that alleges that it really was the people of Israel that caused Jesus's death. I mean, if you were a person of the people of Israel, and you went to, let's say, a centurion who was in charge of 100 soldiers, and said, "Could you please kill that guy?" You'd be more lucky if you got killed. Because they don't want anybody from that they've already beaten on the battlefield. They don't want them telling you what to do, and they're more suspicious if you reach that, if you say something like that. So I would tend to say it's later in at least the 2nd century, if not longer, that we find that. And I think whatever reason that is told, it just goes against the grain of the way Rome taught, what Rome did to so many other people. In other words, I want to raise the question about all the later Christians and how much they taught people to hate Jews.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see how those interpretations have led to anti-Semitism. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. John, can I show a couple more
Just
pictures?
one more. We have one more question
Okay.
from Martha and Rusty.
This is just a comment more than anything, and I'm sure you resonate with this very well. That of course James Cone wrote The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and, and a parallel seems to be of lynchings in our country and the 400 years of slavery and violence and dislocation and oppression that the African American community went through, and it seems like such a clear parallel of mass terrorizing entire communities by these acts of extreme violence. So just a comment.
Thank you. Yes, Jim and I were on the same, our offices were right next to each other. We went regularly together to lunch just to talk about Roman violence. And he was writing that book right at the same time. Yeah. So, John, let me show you some slightly less gory pictures. Here we go over here. Now this, I think, is going to be a, I don't think I showed this to you last time, but this is just a little writing on the crucifixion, just to remind you of what the Bible says that fits right well with this. I'm going to just read this. The crucifixion of Jesus is exhibit number 1 as evidence for violence at the heart of the Roman rule. The basic facts about Roman crucifixion lay bare the charge. 1, Romans crucified hundreds of thousands of those they conquered. 2, crucifixion was the act of nailing a person to a makeshift tree until they slowly died. 3, such government crucifixions were intentionally public torture and terror. Number 4, many of the early communities of the anointed emphasized the centrality of crucifixion for who they were. Early anointed association envoy Paul said, "I know nothing but Jesus anointed and him crucified. By the way, that's Paul kind of downplaying the resurrection. The gospel attributed to Mark has Jesus saying, "Those who want to be a follower of mine, let them take up a cross." Paul understands himself and his relationship to Jesus associations in terms of crucifixion. I am crucified with the anointed, and yet I am alive. So just to, in other words, notice how much there is there about Jesus dying for our sins. There's nothing in these key passages that have that as the primary meaning for the resurrection. Rather, they are holding up the resurrection to be connected to people, all of the people, not just people from Israel, but all over the place, other people's nations who got creamed. Okay, now here's a couple of pictures. So this is a big, there's a whole bunch of these sculptures in Asia Minor, and basically they're big pictures. They're a little bigger than full life size. These are basically all, sculptures of all the different nations that Rome beat or took over. And here you see one of them, you'll see, and all of those nations are represented by women. That is, a picture of a nation is a woman. And this woman here has a particular sign of what was happening to this woman. If the right breast is shown, that means that this nation has been decimated by Rome. But this is even worse here. So let me see if I can get this up a little bit. Oops, shoot. Sorry. So this is a picture. The person at the top of this is the Emperor Claudius. In other words, a person who was over everybody else in the entire Roman Empire. And what you'll see is a woman below. This is another one of these women, a woman who represents an entire country or an entire nation. And right underneath this, if you were up close, which I have been to right looking at this in the eye, this is Britain. This is the Emperor Claudius defeating Britain. Now, what you need to know, especially, and this is a little harder, I first need to tell you that one of the ways that the military, the heads of the military, when they go into battle with another nation, and they find after they've won the battle that there are still some other soldiers alive from that nation, the commanders give a command that you have to now, as the Roman people who've just won a battle, to go and rape all of the live soldiers from the other team, from the other group. So what you'll see here is Claudius is in the middle of raping Rome. See it? Coming from the rear with his hand over and with one hand under and one hand over Britain. So in other words, this is a part of about 100 of these statues in Asia Minor, bigger than life, showing how Rome is simply torturing everyone they can in battle. Well, let's take a moment to see what you have to say about these several pictures. And here, let me take that off the screen. Okay, you guys have that? Any thoughts or challenges on this?
Mark. Mark, you're still on mute.
There's Mark.
Yeah, here I am. Thank you so much for joining us, and you've been very informative in all this, and giving me all kinds of things to think about. And one of the takes that I'm taking, at least from this early history of Christianity, is it wasn't so much of God as love, as it is God, or Jesus in this case, having the ability to transcend death and go beyond death, and that this the message or the promise of Christianity, more than a religion of love, rather a religion that can conquer death and can survive the brutality of Rome, and then the later form of Christianity that we see now evolves out of this. Am I right in this kind of a take on what I'm hearing from you right now in this presentation?
Thank you. It looks to me like the Jesus people are making different senses of this violence, and I would I tend to, when I look at what the texts and what people are saying as these groups get together, it seems to me more that they're wanting to be safe in this life and wanting to know how to live in this life without losing your psyche and your family. So no, I would say that the main thing, in other words, they are actually, when you just read the text of the Gospel of Luke, the next two weeks, in which they're talking almost entirely about how they themselves, when somebody tries to hit them, what do you do? When somebody takes their money, what do you do? In other words, it seems to me as if they're much more interested in founding a community that will help you survive and will help you have a new kind of identity for who you are. So I wouldn't want to say that there's no interest in being resurrected, but just and if you read, for instance, what Paul is talking about in his various groups, he's talking about them living together. He's
Mhm.
talking about how they take care of each other. I mean, this is the guy in 1 Corinthians 13 who has an entire chapter about loving each other. So I think it's mostly way later Christianity that thinks that its real journey is to heaven. This is mainly, well, as Paul says again, we're neither male nor female. We're all one in Christ. So, I mean, the things that you all are doing in your church, that has a lot to do. I mean, that goes straight back to, oh, look, there's a lot of difficulty going on in our world now. Let's stay together.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
I just have a comment to make. During a New Testament class when I was in seminary, they handed out a sheet and it described death by crucifixion. Torture is almost a mild word for what goes on. It is
Yep.
just brutal. It literally brought many of us to tears as we read and realized that that's what Jesus had gone through. It really is just unbelievable.
Thank you so much for that. And then if you would see the way Paul does that. Paul says, I think about Jesus's crucifixion all the time because I'm on the way to jail almost every time. And I'm trying to build a community with you. So it's just, he is so interested in how to come out of so much pain on so many fronts, and how to actually be together in having a community together, and having the clear part of that being love. And that's not one-to-one love so much as little group to little group. So I have about 2/3 of the book yet to talk about. But I want to do a couple of things, and John and I were talking about this at the end of last week. How these communities are built. In other words, it's so interesting that in the 20th and 21st century, Christianity is so focused on what happens to the individual. But if you look, for instance, at the texts in the New Testament, basically there is hardly any time a single person being addressed. It's all the we. So, for instance, when Paul says you, he doesn't mean you, one person. The Greek has two kinds of yous, the singular and the communal. And Paul, almost in his 7 letters, he just has about 3 or 4 times it even uses you singular. He's really talking to you all. I think, in other words, let's go, if we want to know how Paul says you, it's Southern. In other words, it's you all that he's really interested in. And that means how when Rome just completely devastated our entire country, and that was who we thought we were, now it looks like the only thing left is to have a smaller we, because our nations have been devastated and aren't acting anymore like we. Now Paul and the writers thereof are simply trying to put together the communal we and the communal you. So then in that regard, there are a couple of things that we found as we were working for 10 years on this that really surprised us about how to build community. The first thing and the only subject matter that we used, we wrote 2 chapters about, was what we alluded to last week a little bit, and that is gender bending. What we were so surprised at is to see how many times the communities have a chance to reach out to one another, meaning within the community, by the way they themselves thought about their own gender. And that is simply that because so much of the family is the patriarchal father that doesn't put people together so much as put people under. But so many of these communities of Jesus people, they it turns out they say all kinds of ways, you know what, would you please help me think differently about who I am as a woman, or who I am as a adult child who never gets any of the money. And then what happens, of course, so many times in the text themselves is they're all working together to that they share their means, and that they celebrate with all kinds of songs together about who they are in Christ, and that's always a plural. So another thing that is we've discussed at quite length in both chapters 7 and 8 is the way women and men as part of this, and it's much more than women and men. But so, for instance, there are a whole bunch of women that cut their hair and start dressing as men so they can be in public. There are lots of men who, and Paul is probably the best at that. The Roman men, the main thing that you do as a Roman man is be over everyone else. And the main thing you do is never show that you're afraid. So what Paul is doing in every letter he writes, he says, oh, by the way, I've been in jail for 3 months because somebody threw me in jail. In other words, no Roman man would do that because that would be shaming. And so what we see is all kinds of genders. There's a beautiful picture in the book of the Acts of the Apostle where a man who's multi-gendered comes and talks about who he is after he's not been allowed to go to a temple because of his genderedness. So then what Philip does in that situation is he baptizes him. He says, no, come on into our family. So again, I guess we can see a little bit about how this surprises us, because in later Christianity, gender bending was not the way to feel closer to each other, but to insult each other. in lots of church settings. Secondly, in terms of building communities, I need to talk to you about this huge phenomenon in the 1st and 2nd century, not only among Jesus people, but in all kinds of different peoples. And this is what we call the supper clubs. In other words, it used to be in the Mediterranean that rich people, one of the main things they did together is come together every week with all your friends and have a big meal. And let's call that a club. So there are hundreds of thousands of clubs in the 1st and 2nd century of Jesus peoples, but there are also all kinds of clubs of family associations, of other religious associations. So in other words, this is a larger way that the people who have lost their home come together and build new supper clubs. So that is another way. It's interesting. We've got a bunch of documents now that are talking about Jesus peoples and talking about synagogues. And what they're saying is they don't, for instance, they don't think of either of them having buildings. They're simply, what they say is, oh yeah, those people of Israel that are now living somewhere else, they're another supper club. That Jesus club, we know that's a supper club because that's what Jesus liked to do so much, is have a meal together. Then finally, one of the key things that is all over the place in the New Testament is bathing. So it turns out that, and we have a half of a chapter on this, it turns out that the word for baptism, and I just misused it. The word in Greek is baptizo. Now, baptizo does not mean baptism. It's the regular old word of taking a bath. And I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but if you go through a town in Israel, and most of the towns, still have houses in some portion or another of them, and the houses are probably maybe 15 to 25 feet wide. In other words, not a very big house. But outside, almost as big as that, is a bath. And that's what people do regularly for the people of Israel. And of course, this is what John the Baptist did, was not baptize people. He invited people to bathe together as a sign that God loves them. So that's all over the place of not only do they eat together, they bathe together. And that's a sign that they all belong together. If by any chance you have some friends and neighbors that are Jewish, see if you can get yourself invited to a bathing, a Jewish bathing dimension, which is still a part of their religion. But what they do is they go into a fairly big hot tub and sing a lot. And so what we've realized in this church, or in this work together on the book, is that there are all of these ways that are communal, that are the key parts to what you're doing. I'm almost out of time, John. I should stop and see if some people have some other thoughts about what I'm doing, or want to ask questions about what I didn't get to.
I think it's remarkable how much we've covered in these two classes. Very much thanks to the wonderful questions from the group. Hal, I'd love for you to just touch on this term Gnostic. That's often a stamp that's put on the texts attributed to the Jesus groups that were not included in the canonical New Testament. What exactly do people mean by that word Gnostic that can be almost synonymous with heretic or heretical, and why is it a problematic term?
Yes, that's really important, John, and I promised to get to that for you and almost missed it, so thank you. So this word Gnostic, it never was used in the ancient world. It sounds like an ancient term, right? But the word Gnostic was first used in the 18th century. And in the last 75 to 100 years, it's really become very fashionable, first by scholars, and secondly by conservative Christians. It's the new word for heretic. And what has happened, no, sorry, excuse me. What has happened is, as you mentioned, John, in the last 150 years, we have discovered in the Near East more documents than we ever had. And this was because basically that a bunch of European scholars and American scholars eventually went to the Near East on vacations. And all of a sudden they started finding things in the marketplace that were real, that looked ancient, and many of them were. And so really, we have so many new documents from the last 150 years that European and American scholars found and are now in all kinds of places in universities and the like. They all are very new. Some of them sound quite a bit like the New Testament. Some of them sound a lot different. But there isn't a us against them thing. It's just a much bigger family of texts than we used to have. So frankly, I feel like what happened was the scholars of the 20th century, after all of these discoveries were being made, they got really scared that they hadn't read the right things, or they hadn't. I mean, I remember, frankly, I remember this. I remember that, oh, I never learned about that stuff. So for the first 20 years that I was reading the new documents found, I would tell all the public, don't worry about that. It's just really a lot of heresy, and you don't need to worry about it. So, so that is what I want to suggest is Gnostic is simply something that we scholars hid with. By the way, just to say, my good colleague, Elaine Pagels, who wrote the best book called The Gnostic Gospels, she brought us in the public so many of these new documents. But after a number of us have talked with her, she says Gnostic was the wrong word.
Thank you, Hal. I think we have time for one more question. If there's a final question. We have 1 minute left, so we may just wrap up if not. All right, well, we did already cover, oh, here's Mark. Last word, and you are on mute. Still on mute, Mark.
What is the right word if Gnostic is the wrong?
Oh,
Word for
yeah,
this.
thank you. All of those, a lot of those are simply very different from one another. It wasn't a big group of people doing that. It's almost as different as the New Testament is from one another. You know, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not the same story. And so we now have 17 other gospels that we found that also aren't the same stories.
Right.
So it's the cool thing and the frustrating thing about this is that we've got way more work in terms of figuring out what this means. But it is true in this book, we had 10 years in which much of what, as you'll see, much of what that book has is a bunch of the new books to much of the new documents that show how bigger the early Christian, the early Jesus groups were.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, well, in an hour and a half, we have covered Roman violence, we've covered baptism, crucifixion, resurrection. We've covered so much in such a small amount of time, and thank you so much for everyone's questions. And Reverend Dr. Hal Talsic, thank you for how you have answered each one of our questions and presented all the information with such care and with such depth. It has been just a real honor to be able to sit here and learn so much from you. If
Well,
you have a final
Jonathan,
word, and if not, we can close out.
if I can just briefly say, anybody who wants to send me an email, I will always answer back. And secondly, please be sure to find out where I've made mistakes. We all do, it's just a process.
All right, and I think that Hal deserves a huge round of applause, so let's give it up for Hal. And thank you all
Hal.
for wonderful engagement.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you.
You've given us so much to think about.
Yeah.
All right, have a wonderful night, everyone.
Take care, John.
Take
Thank
care.
you, John.
Of course.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Martin.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Mark.
Good night.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hal. Let me
You're welcome, John.